Marcus woke up to the sound of his alarm ringing, the familiar jolt of reality pulling him from his dreams. It was a routine morning, just like any other. The sky outside his window was still a soft shade of blue, the sun's rays creeping through the blinds. He stretched out, rubbing his eyes as he glanced at the clock. It was 6:30 a.m., a bit earlier than usual, but today was an important day. He had a flight to catch. A meeting with potential investors. And not just any investors, these were people who could either take his small but growing airline to the next level or bury it under the weight of their disinterest. His life had always been a balancing act. As a black businessman, Marcus had to work harder than most to prove himself in an industry where diversity was still a rare sight. From the moment he started his airline, he had faced skepticism, dismissive glances, and more than one patronizing comment. He had heard it all before. "Are you sure you're cut out for this? Do you really think a small operation like yours can compete with the big guys?" But Marcus had never been deterred. He believed in his vision, in the dream of creating a company that was both profitable and rooted in values of respect, fairness, and community. Today was a testament to how far he had come, and he was determined to make it count. He quickly showered, dressed in a sharp suit, and packed his briefcase with the necessary documents. His wife, Emily, who had supported him through every sleepless night and every setback, was already up, packing lunch for their 2 children. They exchanged a brief but warm smile as Marcus kissed her goodbye. "I'll be back tonight," he promised, grabbing his things and heading out the door. The kids, still asleep, were left with a quiet wave from their father. The drive to the airport was uneventful. He navigated the familiar streets, the cars around him a blur as he thought about the meeting. It wasn't just about making money, it was about proving to himself, to his family, and to the world that success didn't have a color. When he reached the airport, he parked in his usual spot and took a deep breath before heading inside. The air was thick with the hum of travelers rushing by, but Marcus remained calm, his movements deliberate, his thoughts focused. He made his way through security with ease, his mind running over the presentation he had prepared. Once he cleared the checkpoint, he headed to the lounge, grabbing a quick coffee before boarding. As he sat in the first-class lounge, he felt a mix of excitement and nervous energy. This flight wasn't just another trip, it was a pivotal moment in his career, and he could feel the weight of it on his shoulders. He wasn't the kind of man to show much emotion, but today even he couldn't help but feel the butterflies in his stomach. It was then that he saw her. She was seated across the room, casually flipping through a magazine, her perfectly manicured nails tapping impatiently on the cover. Megan. She wasn't a familiar face, but the way she carried herself with an air of superiority made it impossible not to notice her. She exuded wealth, power, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. From the moment she walked into the lounge, it was clear she believed she belonged there, and only there. It was the kind of attitude Marcus had seen all too often, one that dismissed anyone who didn't fit a very narrow mold of success. Marcus had dealt with people like her before, people who assumed they had the right to judge him based on his appearance, his race, or the color of his skin. He'd learned to ignore the whispers, the side eyes, and the condescending comments. But today, something about Megan's presence rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the way she spoke to the staff, demanding, not asking. Maybe it was the way she openly sized up other passengers, as though they were beneath her. Whatever it was, Marcus felt a tightening in his chest. He had dealt with racism his whole life, but today, it felt more tangible, more real, and for the first time in a long time, he felt an urge to stand up for himself. As the boarding call echoed through the lounge, Marcus stood up, slinging his briefcase over his shoulder. He had a first-class ticket, the seat a luxury he had earned after years of sacrifice. He walked down the jetway, his steps steady and purposeful, and as he stepped onto the plane, he took a moment to scan the cabin. The flight attendants greeted him with a polite nod, but it was Megan who caught his eye. She was already settled into her seat, her gaze flicking up to him for a moment before quickly dismissing him as if he didn't belong there. Marcus had grown used to these moments, those subtle, almost imperceptible judgments people made when they saw a black man in a first-class seat. He knew the look, the quick glance, the raised eyebrow, the unspoken assumption that he had somehow earned the seat by accident. But today, he wasn't going to let it bother him. He was here for a reason, and he wasn't about to let anyone make him feel less than. He made his way down the aisle, eyes forward, and took his seat near the window, letting out a quiet sigh of relief. He had done it. He had made it. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and the flight attendants made their final rounds. As the engines roared to life, Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, trying to calm his racing thoughts. He knew the importance of this trip, but he also knew how fragile it all was. The success of his company, the investors' interest, the future, it all hung in the balance. The flight was long, but for Marcus, it was a brief escape from the pressures of his everyday life. He had worked so hard to get here, to this point of success, and he couldn't afford to lose it now. But as the plane climbed into the clouds, little did Marcus know that his day was about to take a turn. As the turbulence of the day settled, the turbulence of an unexpected confrontation was about to begin. Megan, who had been quietly observing Marcus since he boarded, was about to make her move. The tension on the plane, despite the abruptness of the confrontation, settled into a strange kind of silence. As Marcus sat there, the events of the past few minutes replayed in his mind, over and over again, like a loop he couldn't escape. His heart still pounded, adrenaline surging through him, but there was a deeper, quieter realization taking root inside him. This wasn't just a personal insult. It wasn't just about him being wrongly judged by one person. It was about the larger picture, the things that had always been there but were rarely spoken of, issues of race, of class, and the societal tendency to diminish people who didn't fit into a specific mold. He looked around the cabin, his gaze scanning the other passengers, wondering if anyone else had noticed the exchange. Some were absorbed in their own worlds, heads buried in books or smartphones, while others seemed to glance in his direction every so often. It struck him how quickly people could turn a blind eye to what was happening right in front of them, how people often preferred to avoid uncomfortable truths rather than confront them head-on. But not today. Not with this. Megan, on the other hand, was uncomfortably aware of the fact that she had just been publicly called out for her prejudiced behavior. As Marcus watched her, he saw the flicker of realization cross her face, a brief look of shame, though it was quickly replaced with defensiveness. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, the same way she had when she had first spoken to him, with that sense of superiority, as if trying to protect herself from what had just unfolded. But Marcus wasn't sure if that moment of reflection had truly reached her. He could feel a subtle shift in the air, though, perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was a strange, uneasy acknowledgement that something had shifted in that brief moment. Megan's arrogance was not as certain now, not as unshakable. Marcus' own thoughts were clouded by the complexity of the situation. Here he was, a successful man, someone who had worked tirelessly to build a business, to gain the respect and recognition of his peers in a world that too often disregarded him. And yet, in this moment, the reality of how people saw him, how they reduced him to a stereotype based solely on the color of his skin, was laid bare. The pain of that realization was sharp, but what stung even more was the way people like Megan, and perhaps even those who silently observed the situation, seemed to assume they were untouchable, that they could wield their privilege without consequence. The flight attendants had made their way down the aisle by this point, continuing their duties, but Marcus noticed that one of them, a woman with short blonde hair and kind eyes, seemed to linger a moment longer when passing by his row. She didn't say anything, but her eyes met his for a fraction of a second, her expression softening in recognition of what had just transpired. He nodded slightly, offering her a silent thanks for not turning a blind eye. The brief exchange, though subtle, reminded him that there were people who saw the world in the same way he did, people who understood the power of speaking up, even when it was uncomfortable or risky. It was a small act, a quiet solidarity, but it meant more to him than he could put into words. Megan, still sitting a few rows ahead of him, seemed to be trying to reassert her earlier sense of dominance. She talked louder now, her voice carrying over the hum of the plane, though it was clear she was attempting to maintain an air of composure. But Marcus wasn't interested in listening to her excuses or her attempts at damage control. The truth was, he didn't need her validation. What he needed, what everyone needed, was for people to recognize that these types of interactions, the ones that perpetuate stereotypes, the ones that silence others through their prejudices, weren't acceptable. Not anymore. The rest of the flight passed in a kind of suspended animation. Time moved slowly, each passing moment heavy with the weight of the situation. Marcus found himself lost in thought, reflecting not just on the confrontation, but on everything that had led to this moment. He had grown up in a world where his worth was often questioned, where his accomplishments were dismissed, where he had been told, in more subtle ways, that he wasn't supposed to make it. He had worked through those challenges, had overcome the doubts and the limitations placed on him by a society that valued appearance over substance, but it felt different. This wasn't about overcoming obstacles for personal gain. This was about a confrontation with something much deeper, something much older, an entrenched system of bias and privilege that still pervaded many aspects of life. And it had just reared its ugly head in the most unexpected of places. By the time the flight began its descent, Marcus was still unsure of what had transpired. Did Megan truly understand what had happened? Or would she go on with her life, dismissing him as just another angry black man who couldn't take a joke, who couldn't handle the truth? He hoped, in the quiet corners of his mind, that her experience on that flight would force her to rethink the way she saw the world. Maybe she would come to understand that the casual assumptions she held, about him, about others like him, were the result of years of being shielded from the harsh realities that so many people lived through every day. The plane touched down smoothly, the fastened seatbelt signs flickering off, signaling the end of the journey. But for Marcus, it felt like the end of something much more significant, something that went beyond just a flight, beyond just one confrontation. He stood slowly, gathering his things, still absorbing the weight of what had happened. He wasn't angry, not really. He was tired of having to prove his worth, tired of constantly being measured by standards he hadn't set. But he was also resolved. He had made his point, and even if Megan didn't fully grasp the magnitude of what had just unfolded, others in that cabin had witnessed it. They had seen what had happened, seen how a simple act of defiance had cut through the layers of privilege and entitlement. As he walked down the aisle toward the gate, Marcus caught the eye of the flight attendant who had shared that quiet, meaningful glance with him earlier. She gave him a slight nod of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that he had done something important, something that could inspire change. It wasn't much, but it was enough. When he finally made his way into the terminal and out into the busy airport, Marcus couldn't help but feel a small, hard-won sense of pride. This moment had changed something inside him. It had shown him that even in the face of casual cruelty and ignorance, there was power in standing your ground. There was power in speaking up. And that power, he knew, was something that could ripple out into the world, bit by bit, challenging the prejudices that had so long held people in their places. And as he made his way toward the exit, he couldn't help but wonder if, in some small way, the conversation he had started on that flight would continue beyond that moment, beyond Megan's apology, beyond the quiet exchanges in the airport. Maybe, just maybe, it could lead to something bigger, something that could change not just how people saw him, but how they saw each other. As the plane leveled off, the hum of the engines became a steady background noise, and Marcus tried to settle into his seat, slipping into the rhythm of the flight. He pulled out his tablet, reviewing his presentation one last time, making sure he was prepared for whatever questions the investors might throw his way. The first-class cabin, with its plush seats and quiet ambience, offered a rare moment of peace in his usually chaotic life. It was a brief respite, a pocket of time where he could just breathe, gather his thoughts, and feel at ease. But that ease didn't last long. Megan, who had been sitting 2 rows ahead, seemed to be growing increasingly unsettled, her restless energy becoming more and more noticeable. She shifted in her seat, tapping her foot on the floor with impatience. She glanced around the cabin, and then, with a slight tilt of her head, her gaze fixed on Marcus. He felt it before he saw it, her eyes narrowing in an almost imperceptible judgment. It was the look of someone who, for reasons he could never quite understand, felt entitled to pass judgment on others, and Marcus could feel her discomfort, her disdain, radiating in his direction. At first, he tried to ignore it. After all, he had experienced this many times before. The quiet but pointed looks, the whispered comments, the way people sometimes treated him as if he didn't belong in certain spaces. He had always learned to rise above it, to stay focused on his goals, not letting the opinions of strangers derail him. But today, something about Megan's presence, something about the way she made her disdain so obvious, started to get under his skin. He wasn't sure if it was her entitled posture, her confident superiority, or her clear disregard for anyone who didn't fit her image of what success looked like, but it made him uneasy. As the flight attendants made their rounds, handing out drinks and snacks, Megan's voice suddenly rose above the quiet hum of conversation. She called over a flight attendant in the most condescending tone Marcus had ever heard, practically snapping her fingers as she did. "Excuse me," she said, her words dripping with entitlement, "can I get my drink over here? I don't want to wait while you serve everyone else." The flight attendant, who had been nothing but polite, nodded and moved toward Megan's row. It was a minor request, but the way Megan delivered it, sharp, impatient, and dismissive, caught Marcus's attention. It wasn't long before Megan turned her gaze back to him, her eyes scanning him slowly, taking him in with a judgment that couldn't be missed. She looked at him the way someone would look at a piece of dirt on their shoe, a brief, dismissive glance before turning away. But this time, Marcus noticed. He could feel the weight of it, the assumption, the judgment. He tried to shake it off, refocusing on his tablet, but the discomfort lingered. And then, just as he was about to lose himself in his work, he heard her voice again, this time a little louder, as if speaking to someone nearby but clearly meant for him to overhear. "I just don't get it," Megan said with a slight huff, loud enough for several people to hear. "How did he even get a seat in first class?" Her words hung in the air, sharp and biting. "I mean, no offense, but he looks like the kind of guy who would sit in economy." The comment was casual, as if she were merely making an observation, but it was clear that it was meant to sting. Marcus's blood started to boil as he heard her words, his mind racing. He didn't say anything at first. He wanted to, so badly. The urge to turn around, to challenge her, to call her out on her prejudice, was almost overwhelming. But he knew better than to let anger dictate his actions. He had worked so hard to get to where he was, and he wouldn't let anyone, least of all someone like Megan, tear him down with a few careless words. But Megan wasn't finished. Her voice came again, louder this time, directed straight at the flight attendant, who had been quietly listening. "It's just crazy," Megan continued, not even bothering to lower her voice. "People like him, they just don't belong in places like this. I mean, who are they kidding? First class isn't for everyone, you know?" Marcus's pulse quickened. He could feel his hands clenching into fists in his lap. This wasn't just a casual comment, this was racism wrapped in a thin veil of entitlement. Megan wasn't just making an observation, she was making a statement about who she thought deserved to be in first class. And in her eyes, Marcus didn't measure up. The flight attendant, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, her voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I assure you, everyone here is entitled to be in first class, regardless of their background." She paused, then added, "I'm sure our other passengers appreciate the respect we give each other." The words were polite, but they carried a weight that Marcus appreciated. The flight attendant wasn't backing down, and it was clear that she wasn't about to tolerate Megan's blatant racism. Megan, however, seemed unfazed by the gentle rebuke. She simply nodded, the faintest of smirks curling at the corners of her mouth. "Of course," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "I just don't understand it. That's all." Marcus sat there, his jaw tight, his eyes staring straight ahead. He had always prided himself on keeping his cool, especially in situations like this. He knew how important it was to rise above, to show that he was more than just the color of his skin or the judgments others might pass on him. But today, something was different. Today, Megan's words hit harder than usual. Maybe it was the fact that he was on this flight for his business, for his future, and her comments felt like an assault on everything he had worked for. Or maybe it was the realization that there were still people who saw him as less than, despite everything he had accomplished. Marcus felt the air in the cabin grow thick with tension, the weight of Megan's words lingering in the silence. It was as if time had momentarily stopped. He could feel the heat of anger bubbling up inside him, but it was different this time. This wasn't just a random, hurtful comment from someone who didn't know him. It was a direct attack on his identity, on everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to build. The calm and collected persona he had perfected over the years seemed to evaporate with each of Megan's jabs, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus wasn't sure if he could hold it in any longer. He could hear the low murmur of conversation around him, the subtle shifts in the cabin as other passengers began to take notice of the exchange. Some were whispering to one another, their eyes flicking nervously between Marcus and Megan, sensing the unease in the air. The flight attendants had stopped moving, almost as if they, too, were waiting to see how this would play out. The atmosphere on the plane was charged, but Marcus kept his gaze fixed ahead, determined not to let her have the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. But Megan, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the growing discomfort, leaned back in her seat, her voice louder now, still aimed at no one in particular, but clearly intended for Marcus. "I just don't get it," she continued, her tone almost mocking. "People like you, what, do you think you've earned this? Do you think you actually deserve to sit here with the rest of us?" It was that word. Deserve. The way she spat it out made it clear she didn't believe he did. To her, the seat Marcus occupied wasn't earned through years of hard work and sacrifice, through building something from the ground up. It was simply a mistake, a fluke, a glitch in the system. And that stung more than anything. At that moment, something shifted within Marcus. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, and the urge to lash out was overwhelming. He could hear his father's voice in his head, strong, patient, and unwavering in the face of adversity, but today, Marcus wasn't sure he could hold his tongue. He had spent his entire life rising above the hate and prejudice that sought to bring him down, but Megan had crossed a line. She had crossed the line between a casual judgment and outright disrespect. And Marcus wasn't about to let it slide this time. Before he could stop himself, he turned toward her, his voice steady but filled with an intensity he hadn't expected. "Excuse me," he said, his words cutting through the tension in the air like a knife. "I think it's time someone corrected you." Megan looked at him, her eyes narrowing as if surprised by the audacity. "W." He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm brewing inside of him. He had come so far. He wasn't about to let someone like her ruin this moment for him. But the feeling of her eyes on him, the weight of her contempt, stayed with him as the minutes passed. Marcus couldn't shake the anger that was building inside him, a quiet storm that had been brewing for years but had never been unleashed. And just when he thought he might be able to block it out, Megan made one final comment that would change everything. As the flight attendants began to serve drinks, she leaned back in her seat and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I guess this is what happens when people get too comfortable. I mean, seriously, what kind of man sits in first class and doesn't even belong here?" Marcus could feel his heartbeat in his ears. Every word she spoke stung, cutting through his composure like a blade. This wasn't just about class, this was about race, about entitlement, about the invisible lines people like Megan drew between themselves and everyone else. And just like that, the calm facade he had been holding onto started to crack. What was he going to do? Marcus felt the air in the cabin grow thick with tension, the weight of Megan's words lingering in the silence. It was as if time had momentarily stopped. He could feel the heat of anger bubbling up inside him, but it was different this time. This wasn't just a random, hurtful comment from someone who didn't know him. It was a direct attack on his identity, on everything he had worked for, everything he had fought to build. The calm and collected persona he had perfected over the years seemed to evaporate with each of Megan's jabs, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus wasn't sure if he could hold it in any longer. He could hear the low murmur of conversation around him, the subtle shifts in the cabin as other passengers began to take notice of the exchange. Some were whispering to one another, their eyes flicking nervously between Marcus and Megan, sensing the unease in the air. The flight attendants had stopped moving, almost as if they, too, were waiting to see how this would play out. The atmosphere on the plane was charged, but Marcus kept his gaze fixed ahead, determined not to let her have the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. But Megan, oblivious or perhaps indifferent to the growing discomfort, leaned back in her seat, her voice louder now, still aimed at no one in particular, but clearly intended for Marcus. "I just don't get it," she continued, her tone almost mocking. "People like you, what, do you think you've earned this? Do you think you actually deserve to sit here with the rest of us?" It was that word. Deserve. The way she spat it out made it clear she didn't believe he did. To her, the seat Marcus occupied wasn't earned through years of hard work and sacrifice, through building something from the ground up. It was simply a mistake, a fluke, a glitch in the system. And that stung more than anything. At that moment, something shifted within Marcus. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, and the urge to lash out was overwhelming. He could hear his father's voice in his head, strong, patient, and unwavering in the face of adversity, but today, Marcus wasn't sure he could hold his tongue. He had spent his entire life rising above the hate and prejudice that sought to bring him down, but Megan had crossed a line. She had crossed the line between a casual judgment and outright disrespect. And Marcus wasn't about to let it slide this time. Before he could stop himself, he turned toward her, his voice steady but filled with an intensity he hadn't expected. "Excuse me," he said, his words cutting through the tension in the air like a knife. "I think it's time someone corrected you." Megan looked at him, her eyes narrowing as if surprised by the audacity. She was about to say something, but Marcus held up a hand, his expression unwavering. "I don't know what makes you think you have the right to judge me, but I think you've forgotten something," he continued, his voice firm. "I own this airline." There was a beat of silence. Megan blinked, caught off guard, her mouth hanging open slightly as if she had misheard him. Her eyes flicked quickly to the flight attendants, then back to Marcus, her gaze now a mix of disbelief and confusion. "Excuse me," she said, her voice faltering, the smirk fading from her face. "I own this airline," Marcus repeated, his tone still calm but now laced with a quiet authority. "The very seat you're sitting in was made possible because of people like me. People who don't look like you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in. "People who've had to work harder than anyone else to get where we are. So, the next time you think about who deserves to sit in first class, maybe you should think twice before you start making assumptions." The silence that followed was deafening. Megan's face shifted through a series of emotions, confusion, disbelief, embarrassment, before finally settling into one of shame. Her mouth opened as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. She seemed to shrink in her seat, the wall she had built around herself crumbling as she realized just how wrong she had been. Marcus could see the change in her demeanor. The bravado, the arrogance that had defined her earlier, was now gone. Her confidence had turned to discomfort, and for the first time, Marcus felt a flicker of satisfaction. Not because he had won, but because, for once, he hadn't let someone else's ignorance define him. Around them, the other passengers seemed to relax a little, some even exchanging glances, their expressions mixed with surprise and perhaps even admiration. The flight attendants, who had been watching quietly, exchanged a quick nod of approval before continuing with their duties. Megan, who had been so quick to judge, now looked visibly shaken. She remained silent, her eyes on her lap, avoiding any further interaction with Marcus. But the ripple effect of that moment didn't end there. It wasn't just about Marcus confronting Megan, it was about the power of standing up for oneself, about the realization that you don't have to be silent in the face of prejudice. It was about how one person's actions could force a shift in the dynamic, could make others around them take a hard look at their own assumptions and biases. As the flight continued, Marcus settled back in his seat, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. His heart was still racing, but not from anger. He had stood up for himself, for his hard-earned success, and for everyone who had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed because of their race. It wasn't just about confronting one person, it was about making a statement, sending a message that racism, bigotry, and ignorance would not be tolerated, not by him, not by anyone. He glanced out the window, watching the clouds pass by beneath them. The meeting ahead still weighed on his mind, but now, there was a sense of peace. The feeling of empowerment he hadn't expected was undeniable. He had faced down the ugliness of prejudice in its most subtle form, and in doing so, he had reminded himself, and everyone else, that people like him belonged everywhere. He didn't just deserve to be in first class, he had earned his place, just as much as anyone else. And just as Marcus thought the storm had passed, another unexpected turn lay ahead. Megan, still processing the encounter, made one last attempt to regain control of the situation, but this time, Marcus would be ready. The flight had shifted in ways he couldn't have predicted, and the conversation wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. As the flight continued on its steady course, the cabin seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm, the tense atmosphere lingering but gradually fading. Marcus's mind, however, remained a whirlwind. The exchange with Megan had shaken him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the words she had said, it was the disbelief, the casual assumption that someone like him didn't belong in the place he had fought so hard to reach. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a personal moment. It was a reflection of a much larger societal issue, one that had haunted him throughout his entire life, but one that he had learned to navigate, often in silence. But today was different. Today, he had spoken up. And somehow, it had felt freeing. He had no idea that this encounter was only the beginning of a much more significant shift. But as the plane began its descent, the mood in the cabin took another turn. Marcus, still lost in his thoughts, suddenly felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned around to find the flight attendant who had been standing nearby, watching the whole exchange. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, her eyes gleaming with quiet approval. "I just wanted to thank you," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "For speaking up. It's not easy, especially when people like that think they can get away with things." Marcus was taken aback. He hadn't expected anyone to thank him for what had just happened. The flight attendant's words carried a weight he hadn't realized he needed. It wasn't just about confronting Megan, it was about setting an example, about showing that standing up to injustice didn't have to be a dramatic confrontation. Sometimes, it was about simply speaking the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made the other person. Marcus nodded, his throat tight for a moment as he considered her words. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet intensity. "We all deserve respect, no matter who we are." The flight attendant smiled again before walking away to attend to the other passengers, but her words echoed in Marcus's mind. It was a reminder that his actions, even in a small moment, had ripple effects. He wasn't just standing up for himself, he had made a statement, one that others had heard, and one that might just make a difference. As the plane touched down and taxied toward the gate, Marcus's thoughts were still on Megan, but now, they were focused on what had happened after the confrontation. Megan, to his surprise, hadn't said a word to him since their exchange. She had avoided his gaze, keeping her attention on her phone, as if trying to disappear into the fabric of the seat. Her silence was telling, and Marcus couldn't help but wonder if she was reflecting on what he had said, perhaps reconsidering her own assumptions and prejudices. When the plane finally came to a stop, the passengers began to gather their things, shuffling down the aisles in a slow, orderly procession. Marcus stood up, grabbing his bag from the overhead compartment, feeling the weight of the moment settling in. He had stood up for himself, for his dignity, and for the values he held dear. But what now? Was this just another moment in a long line of encounters with people like Megan, or was it something that would spark change, even in the smallest way? As Marcus walked down the jet bridge, he noticed that several of the other passengers were looking at him a little differently now. There was a sense of quiet respect in their glances, a silent acknowledgement of what had transpired. Some gave him subtle nods, others simply smiled at him as if they understood what had just happened, even if they couldn't fully grasp the depths of it. Marcus felt a small wave of pride rise within him. It wasn't just about his business or his success. It was about the way he carried himself, the way he refused to let people like Megan define who he was. When he finally stepped out of the terminal and into the bright afternoon sun, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his assistant. The investors were waiting for him at the office, eager to discuss the new direction of the company. Marcus paused for a moment, staring at the text, and then, with a deep breath, he put his phone back in his pocket and smiled. He was ready. Ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. The fight wasn't just about business, it was about setting a precedent, proving that people could rise above the limitations others tried to place on them. He had made it here through sheer will and determination, and he wasn't going to let anyone, no matter who they were, make him feel any less than he was. As Marcus walked toward his car, his mind shifted back to the flight. Megan was still somewhere behind him, likely in the midst of her own reflection. He couldn't help but wonder how long it would take her to understand what had just happened. Perhaps she would learn from the experience, or perhaps she would simply move on, never fully acknowledging the implications of her actions. But for Marcus, it wasn't about her. It was about the bigger picture. It was about how people like him had to fight every day to be seen, to be heard, to be respected. And if the encounter with Megan had sparked something in the other passengers, even just a small shift in perspective, then it had been worth it. By the time he reached the office, Marcus was fully prepared to dive into his meeting. The weight of the flight still lingered, but he had already made peace with it. He had faced down prejudice and come out stronger on the other side, and now, it was time to focus on the future. As he stepped into the boardroom, he was no longer just a businessman. He was someone who had found his voice, who had refused to be silenced, and who had reminded everyone in that first-class cabin, and beyond, that respect wasn't a privilege for the few, but a right for all. And as he sat down at the table, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the flight attendant. "Just wanted to say again, thank you. You really made a difference today. I hope you know that." Marcus smiled to himself. Sometimes, it's the small moments that leave the greatest impact. As Marcus settled into the familiar rhythm of his day at the office, he couldn't shake the lingering emotions from the flight. The encounter with Megan had been a shock, but it had also ignited something in him, a sense of purpose he hadn't fully recognized until now. In the days that followed, he found himself reflecting more and more on what had happened. It was no longer just about that single moment on the plane. It was about everything it represented. In his quiet moments, Marcus thought about how often people like him had been overlooked or dismissed, whether in business meetings, social settings, or casual encounters like the one on the plane. The truth was, every step of his journey had been paved with resistance. He had fought not just for success, but for recognition, for respect in a world that was often quick to underestimate him. By now, the story of the confrontation had begun to spread. Word had gotten out about the exchange, and it didn't take long for people within his company, and even his competitors, to start talking about it. A few colleagues approached him, offering congratulations on standing up for himself, for taking a stand against discrimination in such a public way. But for Marcus, it wasn't about applause or recognition. It was about setting a precedent, about ensuring that no one, no matter their background or the power they wielded, would be allowed to get away with treating others as less than they were. But the real surprise came a week later, when Marcus received an unexpected call from Megan. He had half expected her to brush the incident off, pretend it never happened, or simply fade into the background of his life. Instead, she was calling to apologize. Her voice, once filled with arrogance and condescension, was now hesitant and regretful. She told him that she had been reflecting on the events, how deeply embarrassed she felt by her actions, and how she hadn't realized the impact of her words, not just on him, but on everyone who had witnessed it. Megan admitted that she had been raised in an environment where privilege was taken for granted, where people like her were rarely confronted for their behavior. But after the confrontation with Marcus, something in her had shifted. She realized that her assumptions about him, about people like him, were built on ignorance and stereotype. As she spoke, Marcus listened quietly, still processing the unexpected turn of events. He wasn't sure what to say at first. He had never expected an apology, let alone one so genuine. But in that moment, he understood something profound. Sometimes, the greatest victories weren't about winning an argument or proving someone wrong. Sometimes, they were about planting a seed of change in someone else's heart, making them think, question, and grow. It was clear that Megan had been given a perspective she hadn't considered before, one that challenged her preconceived notions of power, privilege, and race. "I appreciate you reaching out," Marcus finally said, his voice calm but measured. "But the apology isn't just for me. It's for anyone you've ever made feel less than, anyone who's ever had to endure the kind of judgment you passed on me that day. I hope you take this experience and use it to grow. We all have work to do in unlearning the biases we've been taught." Megan thanked him again, and the conversation ended with a quiet promise to do better. It was a small moment of reconciliation, but it felt like the beginning of something much larger. For Marcus, it wasn't just about one woman's apology, it was about the opportunity to shift someone's perspective, to encourage growth where there had been ignorance, and to break the cycle of racial prejudice that still permeated many aspects of society. The days that followed were filled with subtle changes, both within Marcus and around him. At work, he found himself more vocal about the issues of diversity and inclusion that he had always believed in but had never openly addressed. He began to advocate for policies that would ensure his company's workforce was as diverse and inclusive as the customers they served. The conversation he had started on that flight, one fueled by an unexpected and painful encounter, had grown into a broader dialogue about how systemic prejudice could be challenged and dismantled, piece by piece. But even more than the changes at work, Marcus noticed a shift in himself. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a leader. A leader who used his voice, not just to grow his empire, but to create an environment where people of all backgrounds could thrive. The power of that moment on the plane had resonated far beyond the seat where he had sat. It had awakened something inside him, a new determination to stand up, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been silenced, overlooked, or underestimated. Then came the invitation. Megan reached out again, this time with an offer. She had been working with a charitable organization focused on diversity training and racial reconciliation. She wanted Marcus to speak at their next event, a large, high-profile conference aimed at corporate leaders, educators, and social justice advocates. The event would be a platform for sharing stories like Marcus's, stories of overcoming adversity, of breaking down the walls that divided people. She had come to see the value in using her privilege to elevate voices like Marcus's, voices that had been silenced for too long. Marcus hesitated at first. He had never considered himself an advocate or public speaker in this way. He was a businessman, after all, not a crusader. But as he thought about the potential impact, about the chance to reach more people, he realized this was his moment to make a real difference. He accepted the invitation, knowing that his voice could amplify the message of unity, understanding, and change. As the day of the conference approached, Marcus felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness. He had prepared a speech that was both personal and powerful, one that would share not just his success story but the lessons he had learned along the way. The lessons about fighting prejudice, about challenging assumptions, and about never letting anyone define who you were. The room would be filled with people who needed to hear those words, who needed to understand that change was possible, if they were willing to listen, to confront their biases, and to take responsibility for their role in the larger narrative. When Marcus took the stage, the audience was silent, waiting for him to speak. He looked out at the crowd, at the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, and some eager to hear what he had to say. He took a deep breath and began, not with a rehearsed speech, but with the truth of his journey, the truth of the moments that had shaped him into who he was today. And as he spoke, as he shared his story, he could see the impact it was having. The shift in the room was palpable. His words were resonating, challenging long-held beliefs, and encouraging people to think differently. By the end of his speech, Marcus had done more than just speak up. He had opened a door. A door to understanding, to change, and to a future where stories like his wouldn't need to be told because prejudice would no longer have a place to exist. As the crowd erupted into applause, Marcus realized that this wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others whose voices had been silenced for too long. And as he left the stage that day, he knew that he had made a difference, not just in his life, but in the lives of others. The ripple effect of that flight, of the confrontation with Megan, had spread further than he could have ever imagined, and it was only just beginning.